For many years, Rise of Kingdoms has been a game where pretty much you just slap your commanders into other people's commanders and see who can trade better. But as of recently, Lilith has been adding engineering commanders into the game, a troop type that allows you to use ranged attacks in Rise of Kingdoms and adds a technical new form of strategy to the game. But in today's video, I'm going to give you 4 reasons why siege commanders will pretty much never succeed in Rise of Kingdoms. There are really 4 big issues that hold them back a lot and make a lot of people not want to use them. So in today's video, if you want to know more about why siege commanders will probably never become meta, you want to stick around till the end of the video. Now let me just start off today's video by quickly saying, I'm not saying siege commanders are bad at all. There's no way for me to really say they're like a bad troop type. They get good trades and all, but there's just 4 things which really do hold these commanders back. So I'm not really trying to say siege commanders are weak and you can't use them. Obviously, I know someone on my Discord who's always telling me about siege, and he shows me reports that I would have probably never seen before. But siege commanders certainly have their issues, and we'll start off with the real first issue, and that is, for the early game, there are literally no engineering commanders. For every other troop type, there is at least an epic version of that commander, and there's a lot of early game restrictions with Siege because they have no real commanders. And in the early game, it's where you start to make your first account developments. By the time you hit KVK 2, you've probably made your first at least 1 to 2 pieces of legendary gear. You've at least got like a full epic set of equipment, and all that stuff is nice and all, but there are no epic commanders at all, and you can't even make siege equipment until you hit Season of Conquest. So the early game really restricts you being able to access ranged commanders, and the reason that's an issue for ranged commanders as a whole is because when we look at ranged commanders and pretty much commanders in general, people want to start their account off using that troop type and then developing it into a proper or a stronger march, rather than investing in, let's say, cavalry in KVK 1 and maxing Minamoto, and then using Minamoto till Season 2, and then when you reach Season 3, you get rid of Minamoto and you pick up ranged commanders and you make all new gear. It's really difficult to actually progress into the endgame with ranged commanders. It is probably 2 times more difficult than it would be with something like archers, who are notoriously bad for the early game. So definitely ranged commanders have a very big lack of early game usage, and not to mention, you can't even use ranged attacks until you're at least Season 2. So ranged commanders have got literally no commanders in the early game. You can't really access any ranged attacks. You can't even like save up their equipment because all the blueprints can only be gained in Season of Conquest. And also, all ranged attacks which come from the V formation, you need to be in KVK 2 to actually use them, which definitely is kind of restricting players in KVK 1 from being able to use the commanders, get a feel for their playstyle, and make it like their first investment. Because, for example, I'm sure everyone can pretty much agree, the commanders you invested in KVK 1 then ended up becoming a march in Season of Conquest, which you later developed further. So, for example, I maxed YSG in KVK 1 and 2, and then I invested in Boudica when I got Season of Conquest. I made my first real Archer March, and players who maybe invested in even just an epic infantry commander like Sun Tzu would have developed Sun Tzu with like a 5-1-1-1 Martel maybe Sun Tzu with Bjorn, and then that would have become like a CPO Lao Che by the time they hit Season of Conquest, because they were able to move all their equipment and upgrade their gear and gradually get better commanders. But with siege commanders, you don't get that early game option, which is why we see a very big lack of engineering commanders in the end game, even though they've almost been out for, or like literally almost a year now, and you would have expected to see more players who would be using them if they were a very easy to access commander like the other 3 main troop types. The next thing I would like to talk about with ranged commanders are restrictions on how you use them. Ranged commanders are weird in the way that you can't really move around once they go into their ranged mode. You're stuck in the tower for 6 seconds, and you can see here, it definitely does restrict these commanders. It is very difficult to use ranged commanders in a lot of situations. For example, if you don't have full open field dominance for just the open field in general, you can't really use a ranged commander, since you're just going to get absolutely destroyed by all of just the enemies around you, since they'll be able to overrun your ranged tower, which takes 8 seconds to come out, and then you're pretty much dead. So unless you've got real open field dominance, ranged commanders can be quite difficult to use and difficult to run as well. So you'll notice with ranged commanders, they've got a lot of restrictions on that in the open field. When you're fighting in the open field, you can't really fully utilize them unless it's a very stationary fight and you have open field presence. Otherwise, you're going to get overrun, and the commanders are pretty much screwed from there. Not to mention, if it's a very fast-paced fight, like I mentioned, where it needs to be stationary, they're going to constantly have to go in and out of their tower mode, which is really annoying. It takes a total of like 15 seconds to do that every single time, like total in and out. And if they keep moving away like this, they're going to walk out of range, and stuff like that is just going to ruin around with your tower. So it can be difficult to effectively run ranged commanders on the open field, especially if it's not a stationary fight, and especially if you don't have open field presence. Another restriction with ranged commanders is the fact that they have to use the V formation. You have to use the V formation with ranged commanders, and yes, this is technically, I guess, a downside that they should have, considering they have a unique type of playstyle, but it means you are missing out on a good amount of stats here. So for example, you miss out on 5% skill damage and all the skill damage inscriptions like the Hunter inscription right here. And then even though V formation has its own unique inscriptions, to my knowledge, none of them are too crazy strong. I'll have to try find where I can open those. So here are the range inscriptions that I was talking about before. The first one, Sharpshooter, you gain 5% range damage, which is actually pretty nice. And whenever you launch a basic attack, 10% chance to spend 50 rage to increase the damage of that attack by 50%. We know getting rid of your rage is never really a good thing, especially since basic attacks are never meta in Rise of Kingdoms, at least not at the moment. Then you've got Drilled, you get 5% another boost to range attack. And then if for every 20% units lost on the target, you can get up to 12% more range damage. Really, everything here is just increasing your range damage. And yes, that's not too bad, and it's obviously going to be pretty okay, but once again, there are a lot of other just stronger like things you could put on your commanders. For example, Hunter, you gain 5% skill damage, and whenever you do damage to a target, if it's single target, it's increased by 10%. There's a lot more extra damage you can gain in these other commander like inscriptions and wedge formation and arch formation, which give them a lot more use cases on the open field and don't restrict them in that regard. But with the V formation, it can be very difficult to kind of get the right inscriptions and get a strong march, especially since a lot of things like the Fine Horse inscription, which would be okay on a wedge formation or an arch formation commander, is pretty much useless on a siege commander or a ranged commander, because march speed once you're in your tower is pretty rubbish, and if you get overrun, you're not going to outrun them since you're using siege anyways. So a lot of stuff here is just not very useful for the commanders in their ranged form, and that means when you look at these ranged commanders, they have a lot of restrictions to use them in Season of Conquest. A lot around when you can use them. You have to have open field dominance, you have to be in a fight where everyone's not really moving around too much, and then there's also a lot of restrictions around the gear you can use, and also restrictions around the formations. One thing with the gear I'd also mention is the fact that Legendary Set does not have a weapon. Even though it does have more stats, it is missing that weapon, which would definitely affect them quite a bit, since it is a fair amount of stats you are missing out on, and you have to put an attack weapon on instead, since it's the only other way you can get stats. I mean, you could also put the Siege Epic weapon, but it's, again, an attack weapon as well. So, they're missing weapons. Their gear is, yes, very strong, but they're missing weapons on it. They got restrictions with their formations. A lot of the inscriptions aren't very useful for them. So, you'll notice ranged commanders have a lot of restrictions on when you can use them and how you can use them. The next thing I would like to talk about when you come to using ranged commanders is the fact that they have specific use cases, and this kind of relates to the point before with the restrictions to use them, and it comes back to the open field and me saying they can only really work when you have a lot of open field presence, and the same can be very true for other game modes. For example, in Sunset Canyon, if you're running ranged commanders, you're pretty much going to get absolutely annihilated, since the commanders take way too long to switch into their ranged form, and by the time that happens, the opponent that is fighting you has pretty much killed you. So that's a first just downside to using ranged commanders. A lot of game modes don't really account for ranged commanders. For example, Soroli Crisis, Ian's Ballads, all of those game modes don't really work with them, and because they've got really niche use cases and ways to use them, if you are investing in ranged commanders, you can't really run other marches. If you're using a ranged commander on the open field, for example, let's say I was running a Margaret and a Barbara, I can't really run a Lao Chain as CPO because Margaret and Barbara are going to be really weird, going in and out of tower mode, constantly moving around, because of how much you have to control these marches. But if I'm using just the ranged commanders, I can focus on them, though that means I can't use other commanders like Lao Chain CPO, which means my account suffers in other game modes like Sunset Canyon, Ark of Osiris, where formations don't even exist, even game modes such as Champions of Olympia, range commanders just are not the best, and stuff like Protect the Supplies, once again, range commanders just pretty much do not work. So you'll notice they have a lot of restrictions in those regards, and they have very specific uses, and you have to pretty much only use range commanders, and your account has to become focused on range commanders to really make them a thing. And I think that's something that puts off a lot of players, is because they're so hard to use. They have to be your main focus, but they don't work in a lot of game modes. They don't really work the best on the open field unless you have the right situations and you're playing them right. And if you have any other commanders, like you have an archer march or a cav or an infantry march, those marches are really difficult to run while also using a ranged march. So they have that problem with their specific uses. They don't work in a lot of game modes. They're hard to use on the open field. And then the commanders, other commanders in the game, which definitely make up the majority. I mean, there's only going to be 4 engineering commanders, and there's like 80 other commanders in the game, some stupid number. And you can't really use those commanders, and you're restricted down to 4 commanders. While they are 4 strong commanders, they have their restrictions, like they have to be V formation. You can't use them in Arc. You can't use them in Champions of Olympia. You can't use them in Sunset Canyon, Ian's Ballad, Soroli Crisis. All these game modes, which you definitely need to be able to use commanders, and those game modes definitely make an impact on your account. You can't really fully utilize these commanders in those game modes to get maximum value out of them, and it can be really difficult to run commanders in that. I mean, Soroli Crisis, Ian's Ballads, you can get around it, you can just kind of tank it and hope you can get enough damage in, but with stuff like Golden Kingdom, you're probably never going to reach floor 20 when you are fighting with ranged commanders, or at least it's going to be difficult. Sunset Canyon, you're never going to get a high rank, and you're probably going to lose most battles you do in the game mode because ranged commanders are absolute rubbish in that mode. And then even stuff like Ark of Osiris, if you can't run the commanders in their ranged form, it's just like fighting with siege units, and it absolutely sucks. So they've got a lot of restrictions and specific use cases in that regard, and it makes them hard to run with a murder ball, it makes them hard to use with a lot of events, and the only time they really work is when you've got the perfect murder ball running and you're able to fully utilize everything with them, but that can be really difficult and rare in a lot of situations. So ranged commanders have those specific use cases, and they can't work in a lot of game modes, which is definitely impacting how strong they can be. Now, the 5th and final issue I will talk about, and this is a temporary issue, is the fact that they have a low amount of commanders right now. This is, like I said, temporary. As time goes on, Lilith will add more and more ranged commanders, but for now, you can realistically only run 2 marches once the new ranged commanders come out, and that means because of how specific ranged commanders are and how difficult they are to run, you are kind of stuck with those 2 marches. You can't really invest in archers, infantry, or cavalry like I said before. So this is a small issue and a temporary issue, something that will gradually not really be that important. But for now, it's certainly something you should consider. If you do invest in ranged commanders and you have the gold edge to max all 4 of the current commanders, expect to wait probably the next 2 to 3 years before you have like a 3 to 4 march murder ball really running. Probably 4 marches I'd expect within the next 2 years. So ranged commanders, they've got a low amount of commanders right now. This is a temporary thing, but you're really stuck running them. So mixed trooping with ranged commanders, difficult thing to do. So for example, if you run an archer march and archers become not so strong, so let's say Boudica is nowhere near as strong as she is right now, you can just go and grab an infantry march or a cav march and grab a new commander there. But with ranged commanders, you can't really diversify like that. You're stuck with ranged commanders, which means you have to backwards invest and you have to make things that will be pretty poor investment choices. Because even though Margaret and Barbara right now are getting fairly good trades if you are using them as your only march, they are fairly difficult realistically to keep in the meta forever. Lilith is going to power creep them out. New commanders are going to come into the game. They're going to be faster, stronger. They're going to destroy these ranged commanders. And even new ranged commanders will come into the game. So you're going to be forced to use these older commanders for a much longer period of time because of the fact that there are just a lack of ranged commanders, and Lilith obviously isn't going to start releasing 4 per cycle, so ranged commanders are always going to have that issue of a lack of commanders and a lack of new commanders for people who are really wanting to run them a lot. So now the final thing I would like to talk about in today's video is how would Lilith fix ranged commanders in my opinion? How would they make them a more viable troop type, something that more people can use? And I think the first thing we need is just more early game content for ranged commanders. First of all, put formation straight in right out the bat. Like when you first make your account, just add them in. I mean, it's a very small thing to do. A lot of people will agree it's always good to get a head start on the state form and stuff. And even though it would make KVK1 slightly more pay to win, it does give you that option to run range commanders. Or even if you just want to make it so only the formations can be used and the armaments can only be accessed once you hit KVK2. The next thing they need is all their gear should be accessed in KVK1. No one really wants to wait till Season of Conquest, literally not Season 3, Season of Conquest, to access siege gear. It's way too late down the line, and by that time, a lot of people would have just moved on and thought range commanders are a waste of my time because of how difficult it is to get their gear. The next thing they need is 2 epic commanders. Lilith needs to put 2 epic range commanders into the game so that you can actually use them in KVK1, and the reason that's important is because, like I said, those 2 epic commanders with their new gear and the fact they can actually use ranged attacks can develop into something in the endgame so that players who want to use range commanders have that option. Because like I said, range commanders aren't weak. They get good trades, but they've just got their drawbacks in the early game. The final thing I'd recommend with range commanders, and this is probably the biggest thing and maybe one of the more controversial things, is the fact I think that their ranged attacking system kind of just needs a bit of a rework. The reason I say this is fairly simple. The whole having to march your troops out with the V formation and then switch them into their ranged attacking mode and then attack with them is way too complicated. It's way too hard to use on the open field in Rise of Kingdoms, especially with how the open field meta works and how fast-paced Rise of Kingdoms fighting is. So what range commanders really need is they just need to be a normal open field troop with a ranged attack. So for example, right now, instead of going into this tower mode like my Cyrus has, he needs to be able to just attack from a range with siege troops only. So basically, these range commanders can use their ranged attacks from a distance. They're able to deal that damage and deal their skill damage as well, and they're not as hard to run, and they have more viability on the open field. Pretty much, if Lilith wants to make range commanders something that is meta, they need to make them how they did it in Call of Dragons, is what I'm trying to say, where they're really simple to use. You just drag and attack, and they don't really have to enter a ranged mode. They don't really have to enter anything super specific, and they're not restricted out of having to leave range mode and go into range of a target to attack them, and they're not waiting literally 8 seconds to escape when they're getting hit. None of that stuff would really be an issue if range commanders could just attack pretty much at all times. So there's definitely that issue around those range commanders having to be stuck in the tower, and I think that if Lilith made it so they could attack 24/7 or pretty much at all times on the open field, it would make them a much more viable and much more used troop type, and I think we would see a lot more newer and free-to-play players picking up range commanders. So now that we've made it to the end of today's video, I want to tell you guys that I'll be doing a live stream today, actually at 23 UTC. It's 13 hours from this recording, probably around 10 or 9 hours from the time of this video being uploaded. So guys, coming down to the live stream, it's going to be pretty interesting. I'm going to do some crafting. I'll be crafting the KVK weapon right here. I'm pretty sure that's what I will go for. And I'll also be doing some protect the supplies. So coming down to the live stream, 23 UTC, it's going to be a nice, probably hour-long stream. There's going to be protect the supplies. I'm going to do some pretty big crafting. It's probably going to be one of the biggest items I've crafted on my account in quite a while. So coming down to the stream, it's always fun, good place to ask me questions, and this stream coming up is going to be very relaxed. So if you have any questions about range commanders, about archers, about infantry, cavalry, equipment, whatever it may be, come on down to the stream. There's going to be me, a bunch of other people there who will also help answer those questions. So trust me, it'll be a fun time, great time to just get to know me. Even questions about my personal life, I'm usually happy to answer them. So come on down to the stream for some good old crafting and some protector supplies, and trust me, you guys won't regret it. Now, don't forget the stream link will be in the pinned comment and also in the description, and I want to say thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.